make sure your cameras are off and your microphones are muted. Okay, thanks, Caitlin. So the first question before we hand over to our first speaker today from M&G, I can see that some of you have responded already. Well done. How much do you know about investment management? I will just say at this point, we would expect most people to be not much at all. That's kind of the normal place to be. So great to see some responses come in. Fantastic. And that just helps our speakers today understand where you're all at. And you're going to hear a little bit more about what we do in investment management through our speakers today. And we can also share some information with your teachers at the end for them to share with you in class. Excellent. So we can see that some people do know a little, and there's a few that know loads too, which is always great to see. But most of you are sitting at around the not much at all mark. Fantastic. And it's still moving. Great. So moving on to the next question then. What does COP26 mean for you? Now, obviously, it's been in the papers, been on the news. I know you would have had a lot of discussion around this at school as well over the last few weeks. Now, this is a word cloud, so you actually need to type in your responses here. So any words that you can think that actually what COP26 means for you. So it could be political, it could be environmental, it could be economic. Yet what does it mean? It may have been your experience of seeing people out on the streets. Excellent, some good responses coming through here, thank you. And so for our speakers today, we can see where you're all currently at in terms of your understanding and what it means to you personally too. Fantastic. Becoming more environmentally friendly, sustainability, it's a word we use a lot in our sector, sustainability. Yet tourism, absolutely. A longer commute, saving the world, fantastic, I'd like to see some of that as well. Global collaboration. Lots of police, perhaps that was your experience of seeing it out actually on the streets as such over the last few weeks. Combating climate change, the future, completely. Brilliant, thank you very much for your contributions there. It's always good to see where people are. Politicians not coming up with good ideas. I said it could be political if you wanted to too. So with that, it's great to see where you're all at. I'd like to invite our first speaker, Richard Miles, who's Director of Corporate Affairs at M&G. And if you're based around that Stirling area, you will probably recognise M&G as one of the employers in your locality. So Richard, over to you. Just let me know when you want me to move on with the slides.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Real privileged to be here to talk to you today, particularly in the wake of COP26, as Jenny's pointed out. If you can't hear me, because my Wi-Fi is a bit dodgy, please do let me know. It sometimes lets me down, but I'll try to get through this anyway. So my job this morning is really to have a bit of a conversation with you about how increasingly people are looking to use their long-term savings to have a positive impact, not just on the planet, but on people, on society as well. An acronym you'll come across a lot, and which Owen will speak about later, is ESG. We'll come on to that in a minute. Anyway, let me tell you a bit about myself first, because that will help you with the context here. I've been working in the media and in communications for more than 30 years. I spent the first half of my career as a journalist, working for titles like The Guardian and The Times, before moving into the financial services industry and helping that industry to communicate better with all sorts of stakeholders, whether it's students like yourselves, or whether it's journalists, or whether it's investors. So that's really what my job is. It's a great job. I get to meet and talk to lots of very interesting people. I get to wrestle with some of the biggest ideas of the day, and I hope in a small way to make a positive difference. Now, I work for M&G. M&G is a very long established savings and investments business, which today also compromises Prudential. And I'm sure, given that many of you from the Stirling area, you'll be familiar with our site at Crayforth, perhaps off the big roundabout there. There's always traffic jams at certain times. So interesting to see people talking about the impact of COP26 on traffic. Well, you know, I've experienced that firsthand around there. So we've had a local presence there for a long time. Way back in the 90s, Prudential bought a company called Scottish Amicable, which was a local company, and that's part of the reasons why we have a big footprint there. So if we could flip on slide, I think I've pretty much covered that. So I mean, our purpose at M&G is essentially Yeah, great. It's to help people, live the lives they want in the future by enabling them to grow money and to take an income from it. And the way we do that is we take their savings, whether they do it through their pension or whether they give it to us directly or through an advisor, and invest that in both private assets, that's private companies, or in public assets, those are companies with their financial instruments registered on a public market somewhere. We've got about £360 billion under management on behalf of more than 5 million customers. So that's us, really. Increasingly, as I said at the outset, we're being asked by our customers not only to give them a decent financial return from their money over time, but also to make a bit of a difference with their savings. I don't know if you've been following COP26 very closely, but one of the big issues of our time is who's going to finance the transition to a cleaner future? Who's going to pay for all the investments in technology that will enable us to stop using fossil fuels and move to much cleaner energy, whether it's renewables or other new technology that's coming along the lines? I think there's a growing consensus that private companies, banks, investment managers, insurers have a big role to play in financing that transition. And it's what we do increasingly. Now, you'll remember the money that we manage isn't our money. It's money that belongs to you, me, your parents, your grandparents, and so on. We're custodians of that money. But we have a responsibility to invest that in a wise way, in a way that means that we have to take into account all these big issues. Jenny, could you flip through on the slides, please? I've already done this bit, so I did that at the outset. Next slide, please. So I don't know if everybody's come across Al Gore, who's a former vice president of the United States. He made a film some time ago, quite early on, called Inconvenient Truth, which is about climate, the climate emergency. Let's call it what it is. It is a big emergency these days. And it's taken a long time for a lot of people, despite the scientific research, to actually accept that we've got a problem. And it's a global problem. The Earth is warming up. And the whole point of COP26 is to try and get governments, companies, individuals to make changes to their lives that mean that we can contain the rise in temperature to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Okay, because even with that temperature rise, it's going to cause us problems in terms of extreme weather events, rising sea levels, all sorts of things will happen anyway. But that's just to keep the environment in a situation where humankind can continue to exist at a fairly decent level of comfort. Okay, so that's the big ask. All right, can we flip on, please, Jenny? So just a few images of the sort of things that people like to talk about when they're talking about climate emergency, the increase in wildfires, how the polar bears are at risk, and drought. Water is going to be a big, big issue in the future. Who controls water, how you get it to it, and so on. Next slide, please, Jenny. So this is all about the net zero pledge. Net zero essentially means that the world needs to produce no more carbon emissions by 2050. That's what people are trying to do. And by carbon emissions, that means burning fossil fuels, oil, coal, gas, and so on. We have to find alternatives to it. Right now, people are sort of, you might call it, taking the easy way out. So they don't reduce their carbon emissions, but they carry on offsetting activity. They plant a forest, put trees in their garden, they buy credits in the market. But really, if we're going to solve this problem, everybody has to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels. Can we flip through a bit, Jenny? So before I've got a quick video I'm going to show you, but I want to leave plenty of time for questions and so on. But let's go back to ESG, which I mentioned at the top, which stands for environmental, social, and governance issues. And environment is obviously there's climate change in that, climate emergency, but this is all connected with how we treat nature as well. So biodiversity is a big thing, the loss of wildlife, plastics in the oceans, all these things which I'm sure you're familiar with, they all sort of feed off each other. And if we have to tackle them in a holistic fashion is what people generally starting to think about. The S in ESG stands for social. So an important aspect of the transition to clean energy is to do so in a way that doesn't is done fairly, so that certain groups don't lose out. So this could be people of who live in developing world. Okay, so historically China's been seen as a developing market. India, although they're rising up quickly, Africa and parts of Asia. They currently make the least, China and India aside, but in many of these countries, or the poorest countries in the world, they are not responsible for most of the pollution. That's historically been the West that's done that, Europe and the West. And we have to avoid making sure that they're not pay too great a cost for fixing a problem that we've created. So there's that aspect to it. And then for you very much also, there's a generational aspect of a just transition, which is, people of my age, I'm in my late 50s, can sort of turn our backs on it and just dump the cost on your generation. Now, I've got children ranging from the ages of 2 to 22, and I have no desire to do that, but we have to find a way of moving to a clean energy that doesn't unfairly lump all the costs on you guys, quite frankly. And that's a big challenge as well. So the S in ESG covers that, as well as things like, work on diversity and inclusion in companies and so on. So more women in senior positions, more people from ethnic backgrounds in companies and so on. So that's a big drive in the S. And then G is simply the governance aspect of what we do in investment management, which is making sure that companies in which we invest our customers' money do things in the right way and really take their responsibilities seriously. So it was very fashionable just 10 years ago for the companies to have just a single important stakeholder, which was their shareholders. Their job was to make money regardless of what it did for other people in society. Increasingly, people are waking up to the fact that that's just wrong. Okay, I work for a company which is listed on the stock market. We do have shareholders, and one of our duties is to make sure they get a decent return. But we have to balance that with giving a good service to our customers and good value in the products that we deliver to them, and how we look after our colleagues, but increasingly wider society as well. What we give back, how we help governments, build new clean infrastructure. That's all the important things that we do, and we can basically invest our money in lots of different ways, and we sort of have a code which is ABC around our place, which is A is the minimum we should do, and that's to avoid any additional harm. Okay, so we shouldn't be investing in companies that are building new coal mines or new coal-fired. That's a very basic thing that we should be doing. B is being engaged, essentially, working with companies to help them change. And C is really about impact investing, the contribution we make in terms of how we channel our customers' monies into companies that are really going to make a difference in the future, whether that's about the climate or whether it's about the social aspects of that climate change. And one of those examples is this company, Ørsted, which is a Scandinavian energy company that's moved from fossil fuels to renewable energy and wind turbines. Jenny, can you the video if it's...
That's fine. If you can't hear it, let me know and I'll just reshare, because sometimes the tech does that. Okay. Can you hear that?
Offshore wind,
like Harry Potter.
Form of renewable power generation. We've invested in Ørsted, a Danish company which is the global leader in this field. In the UK, Ørsted operates 9 offshore wind farms and is building 5 more.
Welcome to the Burbo Bank Extension offshore wind farm. This is one of our most recently built wind farms, using the world's biggest offshore wind turbines, producing enough electricity for around 250,000 homes.
And what are some of the challenges of operating in this kind of an environment?
We like to put our wind farms where there's plenty of wind. That means we can generate a lot of electricity, but building them in those environments can be quite challenging. For example, lifting these 80-metre long blades 100 metres above sea level to put them onto the turbine is no mean feat. Other challenges here have included dealing with unexploded Second World War bombs on the seabed where we're building, and of course ploughing the cables into the seabed depends on soil conditions. That can sometimes be tricky. So a lot of challenges, but we've learned to overcome them.
And what happens if the wind doesn't blow at all?
Well, there are relatively few days when offshore wind farms aren't generating. Today's one of them, which I think just shows we need a mixture of technologies producing electricity, and we also need to focus on the smart grid, storage, demand-side response, and all the tools that will enable us to balance supply and demand in a low-carbon world.
How are these types of infrastructure projects benefiting local communities?
Our work goes well beyond just producing clean electricity for consumers. We absolutely want to be a good citizen in the communities where we operate our wind farms, and Liverpool's no exception. So we're doing a number of things here. Obviously, we employ technicians locally. We've got suppliers right around the Liverpool area.
And Benj, tell us about your personal journey in the energy industry. You've been at it a long time and you've made a significant shift.
That's right. I spent 20 years in the oil industry as a geologist, but challenges from my children in particular have made me think, you know, I want to do something that's producing a clean future for them and a clean, green future for society. So I moved into renewables, and it's been a fantastic time working offshore wind. I absolutely love it.
Well, and it sounds like there's a lot of future in it as well, and on behalf of our own investors, we're very excited to be part of it with you.
It's great to have you on board.
Thanks, Jenny. So this is just a bit more information about Ørsted. It's a really interesting example because one of the biggest debates in the savings and investment industry is between what they call exclusion and engagement. So exclusion means essentially if a company is deemed to be a bad company, let's say it's a fossil fuel company, an oil major or something, many campaigners, many protesters would have a sellout completely. Right, and say, you know, if you starve them of financial backing, they will stop producing fossil fuels altogether. The problem with that is if everybody did it overnight, then we'd have no energy and the whole of the economy would collapse. Right, so you know we wouldn't have any internet, we wouldn't have any of this sort of stuff. So you have to work towards a transition. On the other side is what's called engagement, which is you work with the companies to help them change. So you provide them financial support and are sort of always in their ear. Now you're going to move towards a transition quicker. And in that way, we can safely and more fairly transition the world to cleaner energy. The downside with engagement is it's very difficult to show that it's working sometimes. And you know, we are just one of many shareholders within a particular business, and you need collective action for a company to take note, really. I mean, if we own just 1% of the business, they can easily ignore us. So you have to be really disciplined and really invest in your engagement for it to work. But also it's an interesting example because it used to be a fossil fuels company. It used to be the Danish oil and natural gas company. Dong, which sounds more amusing to us than to Danes, but you know, but it has transformed it, and you know, through engagement with its shareholders like us, it's been able to make those changes for the better, and that's really a very live debate. The whole thing about do you divest, just walk away from them. The problem with walking away from all these fossil fuels is that other people who are less responsible financial backers will buy the shares on the cheap, and they won't care. So it's a really complex area which we have to sort of wrestle with. It's all about shades of grey, I'm afraid. Next slide, Jenny. I think we're coming to the end, aren't we? This is just another example of where we're channeling our customers' money into things that make a big difference. So this is again about renewable energy and solar panels. But the nice thing about this is if you get it right, you don't disrupt existing activities. So persuading farmers to put solar panels in their fields works quite well because the sheep just carry on grazing around it. So you get double use out of land. Next slide, please, Jenny. So, I mean, this is pretty much, what's coming up. I mean, we've talked a lot about the climate emergency, but I think what people are realizing is that you can't separate the climate emergency from other aspects of how we manage nature. So deforestation, I mean, COP26 was they had their first statement on deforestation. Yeah, it didn't go far enough for many people's views because big nations like Brazil and Indonesia weren't firm enough in their intentions. But it was still a way forward that they did come off with, a statement on deforestation. People are realizing it's not just about the transition to clean fuels, it's also about looking after the planet and reforestation. And that's simply because not only is it good for wildlife and for the planet generally, but trees, as you know, are great stores of carbon. Okay, so it's the other side, if we're pumping out carbon and things can store it, it sort of nets itself off. And that increasingly has turned to the bottom right box, there's a poor looking bird there. But I mean, there's a growing view that we also have to think about biodiversity much more in the way we deal with the climate emergency. I mean, anybody who's found a David Attenborough or read his book or seen his films will know how many species have gone extinct in the last 50 years, the last 100 years, and so on. And people increasingly think that the decrease in biodiversity is linked to pandemics and disease and so on. So we have to start thinking of these things in a round. So that's that's where it's going. I mean, it's one of the reasons why savings and investments is so interesting. Is because we're having to make decisions on these type of things and use our influence as well as our customers' money every day on these big issues. I think that's the end, Jenny. Is it? That's the last slide? Or is it next one?
Yeah,
yes.
It's indeed. There's been loads of questions coming through, so thank you for everyone who's put some really sensible and relevant questions in the chat too. So Richard, there's 4 that I've picked because there's quite a few similar ones, and I'm just bearing in mind that you've got 5 minutes, so I didn't want to accept you too much, Richard.
Okay.
To answer loads. Do you want to take them one by one here, Richard? And
yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay, great, go for it.
I can't see them in the chat, so you'll have to throw them out.
Oh, so they're on the screen. I don't know if you can see them on the screen, but I can read them out to you in case you can't see them. Yeah, can you see them?
Do I believe that Boris Johnson should take climate change more seriously than the economy? It's not an either or question, is it? You have to do both at the same time. One of the big challenges with tackling the climate emergency is the harsh truth is that people in the West have enjoyed a very high standard of living, and we're going to have to, in time, unless technology comes to the rescue, we're going to have to settle for a less high standard of living, and no politician really wants to admit that. So Boris Johnson, for example, said you don't need to wear a hair shirt and solve the climate emergency. By hair shirt, it means you don't have to make life difficult for yourself. Well, actually, we do have to think about things like giving up our cars, and a lot of people will find that hard, and it will have economic consequences. So it's tricky. It's a great question because it really is at the crux of everything. How do you deal with this looming climate emergency and still, make sure the economy ticks along? Hope that's answered that one. As much as I can. Do you believe that go back.
No, that's it. That's fine.
So do you believe that diversity within staff can help generate new ideas that can help save the world from climate change? There's 2 parts to that question. Another great question. So diversity, I mean, there's an increasing amount of research that suggests that if you put people all from the same backgrounds in the room, they end up coming to the same ideas. You get what they call groupthink. You all start talking about the same things, and you don't become aware of alternative ideas or new ideas or so on, because you get so wrapped up in your circle, and it's self-reinforcing. It's a bit like hanging out with heavy rock fans, and you might be a classical music buff. You need the different perspectives. They will feed off each other. So it definitely helps a business. And the big drive across our industry, which historically has not been very great at this. I mean, it's traditionally full of white middle-aged men like me, and we need to move that. We definitely need to move that. We're trying hard to do that. I mean, we do need to make progress on gender. We need to make progress on ethnic background as well. And the one for me really is about social background as well, because that's where you get the genuine diversity of you, in my opinion. It's when people have had different life experiences and been raised with different assumptions that you start seeing the different perspectives. And I've sat in meetings which is tick the boxes with, you know, in terms of gender and ethnicity, but everybody's got the same worldview because they all went to the same schools and they all went to the same universities. So that, you know, you've got to, you know, it really is about, for me, about the social class that matters. Can it help save the climate change? Well, I wish it could. It will help. It will help, but I don't think it will solve it in its own right. Do you think that 2050 is too late? Personally, yes. You know, what 2050 means is that we have to, you know, there's a lot of debate about whether 2050 and net zero and 1.5 are real or whether they're just political devices. In a way, it doesn't matter. What we do know is that we do have to act quickly to get on with things. And what if you're going to hit 1.5 by 2050, that effectively means that you have to halve the level of carbon emissions globally by 2030. Okay, so if you think about 2030, 8 years away, that means you've got to reduce carbon emissions, stop using fossil fuels for about 7%, 8% a year, each year for the next 8 years. Okay, so if you start playing back from the 2050, then wow, yeah, it is that, you know, but yeah, you know, the politicians like 2050 because they're not going to be around in 2050. I mean, if you got them to talk about 2030, then they'd be much more focused on it. You know, if Boris Johnson does want to be Prime Minister for 10 years, then 2030 is there, you know? Should climate change be taken more seriously than poverty and world hunger? Oh, what a cracking question. I've just been reading a book by a Danish scientist and economist who's always been very skeptical about climate change. And it's the point that he makes, which is, but there are bigger problems out there. Well, the problem for him is that you know, climate emergency, unless we get on top of this, is going to exacerbate it for, you know, poor people are going to suffer the most. And with poverty goes hunger as well. I mean, we've got to tackle these things, but you've got to do it all in the round is the point. I mean, we live, if you just take the issue of rising sea levels with global heating, then all the projections show that Europe will actually be not in a bad place. You know, some parts of southern Europe won't be so bad, but, you know, certainly in northern climes, most of, you know, England and certainly Scotland, but where it will hurt most is in Africa and other places where the temperatures will just get so high that people won't be able to stay there. They'll move. They'll have to move. You know, the planet will become uninhabitable in that sense. So in a way, by tackling climate emergency, you are indirectly and directly tackling the issues of poverty and world hunger. But you know, climate emergency shouldn't be done to the exclusion of all other things. You know, there are plenty of good work going on with poverty and world hunger. Poverty, you know, I mean, United States, for anybody who wants to look at it, is got shockingly, you know, shocking proportion of the population lives effectively below the breadline there. So even in one of the world's richest nations, you know, poverty is never very far away. We have our own problems in the UK as well. So I hope that's answered those questions. We've probably got time for one more if there's any more.
I think there's a few more, but I think they've all been really good. That's the thing. I think if I gave you one more, Richard, you'd need another 5 minutes just to answer one. They're really good, challenging questions.
I'll go quiet now and I'll hand over to you, Owen.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Thank you for Richard. That was a real challenge. We set you to cover all of that in about 30 minutes, including questions. So thank you for that. And then we're going to move on now to Owen. So Owen's joined as a trainee and he's now at Martin Currie doing a job in ESG. So everything that Richard's just been talking about, essentially. And he's here to share with you his own experience. So again, Owen's going to do it really quickly. He's got just 5 minutes in terms of his own experience of working in the industry in an ESG role. So Owen, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Jenny, and thanks, Richard, and everyone that was involved in organising this talk, and thanks for all the fantastic questions. It's fantastic to see young people so engaged in climate change and the environment, but especially thanks to Investment 2020 it's no exaggeration to say that I wouldn't be sitting here without them. So I started with Martin Curry back in January as a business support trainee through the Investment 2020 programme. And it was a fantastic opportunity, as strange as it was to be joining in an all virtual environment. But as part of my role, I had the opportunity to work with different teams. So I worked with the likes of distribution and marketing, so selling our products, trading, so actually buying and selling our shares, and then eventually working with the investment floor, which is how I got involved in ESG. And as an analyst, there's an awful lot to do with ESG at the moment. It's a fantastically growing industry. There's always new things to learn, which can be overwhelming at times. But I think if you ever stop learning, it's probably time to retire. So in terms of my day-to-day, I do a lot of work touching on what Richard was just talking about. So ESG, so analysing companies through these three separate pillars. So if we consider the environmental pillar, obviously Richard touched on climate change and biodiversity. Those two are completely linked. They don't come separately. And then we also touch on the likes of water usage, but as well as considering how a company affects the environment, it's almost as important to consider how the environment affects companies. And we look at this through both physical risk, so say the likes of a drought, how that might affect a company's supply chain, or an earthquake or a hurricane, and also the transition risk, so how a company will be affected by a transition to a lower carbon economy. And this is exactly the sort of things that we consider for the likes of Ørsted, in that they transition from being an oil and gas company towards a cleaner energy company. That's all part of the transition economy that needs to happen. And it's interesting to see big oil companies like BP and Shell, really getting a bit more behind climate change. Some people might say that they're not doing enough, but every single step is a step in the right direction. And then we move on to the social sort of lens to look at companies. And this could be sort of health and safety of workers, labour rights, but also how a company is incorporated into the wider community. And this is especially important if we consider, Indigenous and Native communities, and making sure that a company, isn't taking over their land, and really being fair to every single stakeholder involved in a business, from, the downstream customers and the upstream supply chain, and making sure that everything is fair and equitable along the way. And then moving on to the last pillar, the G, the governance factors, which is probably the most traditional aspect of financial analysis, in that we consider, board composition, and, we've touched on diversity earlier, and how we need more diverse thought. We need more women in the workforce, and at board level, we need more ethnic minorities at board level as well. And all of these things avoid that groupthink that we spoke about earlier. And that's where we get the best ideas. And there have been studies that have shown that more diverse boards have better financial performance and share price, which is what we want as investors. And then moving on to engagement. And engagement is a fantastic way in which we can affect change as investors, be it individually or part of larger engagement groups like Climate Action 100+. And I think engagement is probably one of my favorite parts, because it's a fantastic opportunity to meet with, the CEOs of Adidas or Under Armour or Apple, or all these big major companies that we know about, and really get one-on-one time with them to either learn about the company. So you could ask what their sort of long-term strategic thoughts are. You can build a relationship with them. And then perhaps most importantly is engagement for change. And this is where we speak with companies about best practice in certain areas. So at the moment, it could be about climate change. So for instance, we've interacted with an Indian cement company to try and get them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. We've also had contact with a Chinese social media giant about how they can, affect change within young communities and teenagers throughout the country. And it's these, important interactions that really make work and investment quite rewarding, I think. And as Richard said earlier, there's no real way to see that your engagement actually affected that change. But yeah, I'd like to think that we may have had something to do with it. So those are the sort of ESG pillars and engagement that we spoke about. There's also a lot of work going on at the moment on the less sort of rock and roll side of ESG, and that's the regulatory side of things. So it gets a little bit dry, it gets a little bit legal, it gets a little bit technical, but it's just as important. And it's important because we have to be sure that what we are selling as sustainable or environmentally friendly is actually what we say it is. So this is to combat greenwashing. So claiming to have environmental characteristics that we don't actually have. And the difficulty with this comes in that we sell our products globally, and there's different regulations to meet in the UK, in Europe, in Australia, in the US. So what needs to happen is a proper cohesive sort of legal structure and regulatory framework where everyone can get on the same page and we can trust that the products that we are invested in are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing when they're marketed as sustainable or environmentally friendly. So I think that's just me coming to an end of my time. It's difficult to distill all my work into 5 minutes or so, and that's cutting out all the waffle of going to get coffee and chatting with coworkers. But I hope provided a little bit of insight into my sort of day-to-day work working in ESG. Thanks very much.
Perfect, that's great. Thanks, Owen. And just so people are aware, you joined the trainee programme in January, and I will come on to tell you all a little bit about the trainee programme at the end. Did you come straight from university, Owen, or did you do other jobs beforehand?
No, so I finished university and wanted to get an investment, but I never sort of led anywhere. So I took a couple of years out, went to Canada, and was fortunate enough to work out there for a bit, just doing bartending and odd jobs and really gaining that life experience. I think, if I'd gone straight from university, there's a big maturity gap between leaving university and then joining the workforce. So I'm personally glad that I had that opportunity to take some time out, sort of learn a bit more about myself, gain a bit more maturity, and then join the workforce with a bit more experience behind me.
Perfect, that's great. Thanks ever so much. And then from someone who joined with a degree and as a graduate, we move on to Andrew. So Andrew only recently finished his apprenticeship, who joined straight from school at M&G. So Andrew, over to you. If you can just share a little bit about your journey and kind of where you are now, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. So I took the opposite route from Owen. I pretty much came straight from school. So we finished early in March 2020 because of COVID and stuff, and I hadn't planned to go to uni, so I just worked part-time for a bit, and then I'd been at an M&G open day a couple months previous, and I really liked sort of the opportunities that were available, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to get into, so I had a little look and decided on doing the sales support apprenticeship. So I applied for that, and it was quite a long recruitment process. There was online interviews, video interviews, and we weren't in the office because of COVID. So we had assessment centre days online, and then it eventually led to me getting the job. So I began that a year ago. It was October 2020, and through that we've obviously have been working on the job. So in sales support, we basically support advisors with existing business and bringing new business into the company. And I've also worked alongside, so we have a training provider called BPP. So they basically help us, since it's an apprenticeship, with a qualification which you get, which is sort of equivalent to 2 Scotch hires. And then we also work with Investment 2020. So they help us a lot with, things like this, presentations, because it's all been virtual. So I haven't even been in the office yet. So we do that with them, and it's led into me getting a marketing role, which I start in the next week, really. So they're a really good company in terms of pushing you forward. If there's something you want to try out, like for me, my interest was in marketing after the sales support role, then they'll help you with that. And there's lots of opportunities within the business, even though it's all been from home. I've been able to meet a lot of people and really network with a lot of people, because it's a different experience to uni. Definitely, you're getting paid for the job, but it's a good opportunity, so I've really enjoyed it.
Perfect, thanks. And so you're now in a permanent role in marketing, so that's the next step of your career.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, in the next, so it's a fixed term contract for a year, but I definitely like to progress within that team. There's definitely the opportunity to do so. So that's my aim for the next year.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a question just come in just before we sort of start to wrap up. We've got lots of questions coming. One but specifically for you, Andrew, is what grades did you have to get on the apprenticeship at M&G, if you can remember? And sorry, I was just saying also, would you recommend, based on your experience, so, you know, rather than advice to everyone, but your experience, would you recommend doing an apprenticeship more than going to university?
Yeah, so for the grades, I think there was only 2 you needed. I think it was a C in National 5, Maths and English. So that was just a basic requirement, which I thankfully had. But as for hires, there wasn't any requirement with that because I think you can do it as an apprenticeship. So I assume it's from, I was 17 when I applied, so it's from a young age. And then the other question, yeah, I definitely recommend. I think there's benefits of going to uni and then there's benefits of an apprenticeship. But for me, I've really enjoyed my time getting paid on the job and learning something I really want to do. And we also get support in, it's not exams as such, but workbooks with BPP. So you are doing coursework as well alongside your work. So I definitely recommend it. But if there's a specific thing at university you want to study, then I'm sure Owen would recommend doing that as well, because that's also a good way to get into whatever it is you want to do. So.
Absolutely, thank you. It's all about doing your research, isn't it? And making lots of applications. Absolutely. That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Before we go, and actually I will ask our speakers to stay on, because even if schools and colleges have to log off at 12:45, there's a few really good questions that have come through, and perhaps we can capture your answers on the recording. So when we send it out to schools, they're able to access them. But just quickly, you've heard both Owen and Andrew talk about the Investment 2020 programme. It's essentially a 12-month paid job. So Andrew did an apprenticeship version, and obviously Owen's doing the trainee version. And essentially you get your, what we call, foot in the door, your feet under the desk. You get taught and supported in knowing how to do a job well in our sector. And there's all sorts of jobs that we have in our industry, the sorts of ones that Andrew and Owen have spoken about, but a whole variety, and you can find those on our website. We have over 60 firms now supporting us, and you might recognise some of those brands that are up on the slide now, obviously including M&G and Martin Currie too. So as a student, you can register with us to receive our vacancies as they come out. So the M&G apprenticeship, for example, if you're in S5 or S6 at the moment, you might be thinking this could be for me. If you register with us, we will send you those vacancies as soon as they come out in the new year. That's the easiest way to keep up to date. And then just handing over to Caitlin to talk a little bit about the Unified Schools programme, who we've partnered with today to run this event. Caitlin, over to you.
Thanks, Jenny. It was a really good session. Thank you so much to all the speakers. I found it really, really interesting. It's just nice to know what sort of roles are out there in financial services. And that's essentially what the essence of the Unified Schools programme is. So we're run through Scottish Financial Enterprise, and what we are aiming to do and have been doing throughout the year is working with organisations such as Investment 2020 to run panel events and share knowledge and content with schools across Scotland to learn about careers in financial services. So if you're a teacher and you're currently on this call, if you have an idea for a session you'd like to run where you'd want to introduce your students to careers in financial services, you want to learn a little bit more about all the different sectors there are and what kind of opportunities there are after school, after university, or after college, please do get in touch. And as a student as well, we have a page on the Developing the Young Workforce website. So it's the little link down the bottom there. So when we share the slides after this, you'll be able to access that site, and that's got some helpful videos about different sectors in financial services, and it's also got links to all of our partners, including Investment 2020, that should help give you some ideas for opportunities you can go for right out of high school. So thanks very much, Jenny, for running this session with us, and there's a lot more information on that slide which I won't go through that you'll be able to see when we share it after the session.
Perfect. Thank you, Caitlin. So if there's any students left, I know we've just gone a couple of minutes over. We've been trying to be quite tight with time. There's a lot to get through. If you could just answer any of these questions for us that are up here. The results don't come up on the slide, but it'd be great if people could just put their thoughts down. How helpful has today's session been? Using your Slido browser, just answer that question for me. That would be really helpful. I can just see the numbers going up. So a few more just for us to understand where it's lied today with you. We will be sending these slides out, as Caitlin said, so your teachers will be able to share additional information with you. That's absolutely fine. And in terms of, well, how much more do you know about investment management now as a result of going through the session? Again, if people would just do a few clicks for me, that would be really, really helpful. We are going to stay on the line as long as that's okay with our guest speakers today, because there's 3 really super questions that have come through. Thank you to everyone who's put questions in. There was lots and lots and lots coming through, but there's 3 that really stand out. And I think if our speakers give us just a couple of more minutes of their time, it'd be great to get their views on these as well. So here we go. So Richard, Owen and Andrew, you may all want to contribute, but we've got here the first one. I mean, Richard, this feels like this might be one for you, possibly to lead off on here with the first or second one up there, if you're able to.
So I assume that's why are big investors still investing in property?
Yes.
In the water, global warming. That's a really good question, actually. I don't know why is the answer. I mean, it's pretty clear. I mean, in a way, we're not just not just investors, but society as a whole is still building on floodplains right now, partly because it's an easy thing to do. I suppose it's awaiting direction from the government before they stop doing it. And to be fair, it's also not clear. People talk in aggregate terms when it comes to the climate emergency. Sea levels will rise by X meters or whatever it is. People have done scary charts about. Owen will know this better than I do about which parts of it are going to be flooded. I mean, there is a scary figure out that says that 1 million people in London alone will be displaced by rising sea levels. We are better at building sea defences and river defences, so I don't really know. It's not straightforward, that one. Owen, I don't know what you've got to add, what your perspective on that would be.
I wish I knew the answer. I guess in part maybe banking on sort of adaptive activities to really come to the fore to protect those houses. Maybe we're hoping that mitigation efforts will really do the job and they might not end up underwater at all. But I don't have any sort of solid answer, I'm afraid. If I did, it'd be a rich man.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are really good questions because it just identifies actually the complexity of the situation, doesn't it, as well? Really good questions. The second question there, does anyone want to take a stab at answering that one for me?
Well, it's something that I think about a lot because it's really interesting that one of the themes that came out of COP26 was, whose responsibility is it to fix everything? The individual, I mean, crudely put, it was the individual versus governments versus business, essentially how it boiled down. And industries have a great knack for pointing at consumers and saying, you're the problem. But here, we've got a solution on how you can fix it. There is no doubt that it's a systemic issue. It's a systems issue rather than an individual issue. I mean, individuals can play their part in it. And it's quite interesting. One of the best sort of guides to what you as an individual can do, I've seen, comes from the Grantham Institute at Imperial College in London. And it has 9 things you can do to save the planet. And it has the usual stuff about, making your own underwear from recycled plastic and things like that. But the top of the list is use your voice, okay? Because it recognizes that only by collective action and by individuals putting pressure on their politicians and on companies will we actually get any meaningful change here. So individuals have a part to play, but the bigger part is with governments and secondly with businesses, I would say.
No, thank you for that. And actually, one of the other questions that come through, which is up on the screen, is actually, should the government be listening to the voice of young people on climate change, seeing as if we are going to be the ones that are going to be affected? And you sort of referred a little bit to that earlier, Richard, didn't you, as well, saying actually it's the people not necessarily our ages, but though, my kids, your kids, who are going to be really living with this.
Yeah. I mean, my 22-year-old son, who loves my roast lunches, has just gone vegetarian, much to my chagrin. And my daughter has been a vegan for some years, both on principle that they see it as a way to contribute to reducing carbon emissions. So young people are taking this far more seriously than old people like me, and therefore the government should listen to them. The problem is that young people don't really vote, and they certainly don't vote for the Conservative Party. So there's our demographic process, certainly in this country, isn't geared up to hearing their voices in a meaningful way, which is why they take to the streets. I was interested. I did a sort of quick poll of friends and family about what were the messages that were coming through from COP26. And the most common thing that said to me was blah, 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 which is, Greta Thunberg's, pithy and perfectly formed way of summing it up. I feel there is a sense that young people in particular feel that there's a lot of talk by old people and not enough action. Anyway,
Thank you.
Off my soapbox.
That's okay. No, we like a soapbox. That's absolutely fine. So last two questions here. Owen, you might want to take a stab at this last one. Do you think ESG focus may be the main responsibility for the current energy crisis? Because we've all experienced that, haven't we, over the last few weeks? Certainly my energy bills have gone up massively. Owen, have you got a thought around that or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's another difficult question, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think when we consider the sort of environmental factors of sort of oil and gas industry, it really brings ESG to the fore. But I think it's a massive argument for, alternative fuels. It shows that we are still so reliant on, gas coming from Russia and stuff. We really need to have, these clean energies coming to the fore so that they can take some of the burden off the oil and gas networks. But again, this is a fantastic question because it just goes to show that, you may think that ESG is, solely limited to investment management companies, but in fact, it affects every single one of us in our everyday lives. And as Richard was saying, young people really are becoming more aware of, the collective action that they can undertake and really influence the global economy. Sort of touched on the previous question, maybe the case that 70% of global emissions are by multinational enterprises or whatever. But the reason that they were creating these emissions is because we were demanding their products. So, if we change consumer demand, we stop demanding as much meat and animal products, then the companies will realize this and start to invest a bit more, hopefully, in, alternative proteins and plant milks and, mitigation and adaptation strategies and all the rest of it. But no, it's fantastically thoughtful questions coming through, and I don't know if maybe Richard has anything to add to that, but yeah, it's fantastic to see such engaged thought on the process.
Absolutely. We've had some amazing questions today. Sorry, Richard, carry on.
No, I didn't really have anything to add to that. And, obviously there's the geopolitical risks involved with any energy supply and, frosty relationships with Russia and, the whole COVID pandemic has disrupted supply chains and so on. It's all had an impact on this. But yeah, it makes exactly the right point, which is ESG is not just something that's done in a closed room with specialists. It is the warp and weft of our life these days. Absolutely.
And that's a great note to finish on as well. Thank you, Richard. Always a great communicator. So thank you to everyone who's come along today. There you are. Thank you to everyone who's come along today. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to all the schools and colleges. If you're still with us, we really appreciate you taking the time. And Caitlin will be sharing information from this session with you as a follow-up if you want to share with other students as well. Massive thanks to Caitlin and to Rachel from DYW and from SFE for making this USP partner event with us work today. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks ever so much.